Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And although our team has had a 3-6 record here in the month of July, as we close in on the All-Star break here in 2033, I think we're in pretty good shape as far as saving these Oakland A's. We're 5 games up on the Astros, who would be the first team out of a wild card spot in the American League at this point. So even though we're 7.5 behind the Rangers in the division, we're positioned reasonably well to hopefully make a 4th trip to the playoffs in the last 5 years. We have slipped a bit to 10th out of 30 in the power rankings, but with 12 teams going to the playoffs, that still puts us, I don't want to say firmly, but reasonably securely in a playoff position. And hopefully we'll be able to play a little bit better over this second half of the month of July as we head towards the trade deadline. Taking a look at the schedule we do have ahead of us, we're going to get a lot of good information between now and the trade deadline because we've got 5 series left in the month, and 4 of them are against our divisional rivals. We've got 4 against Seattle coming up. Actually, only 3 of them are against our division rivals, if I could do some simple math. Then we've got 3 against the White Sox before the All-Star break, at Texas and at the Dodgers, obviously a division series against the Rangers, and then that Houston team that's chasing us for the final 3 games of the month at home. So we've got Seattle, we've got Texas, and we've got the Astros in the division, in addition to the White Sox and the Dodgers before we get to the end of this month. So with 10 games against divisional rivals, hopefully we'll know even more about how we stand in terms of the divisional race, and probably more importantly than the division race, the playoff race before we get to the end of this month and the actual trade deadline. And as we get this episode started, as always, our worldwide scouting department has come up huge for us. We've got a ton of great thoughts from viewers on what we should do in the first-year player draft, which is today. So we'll be talking about that in a lot of detail, and thanks to all of you who shared your thoughts with me on this episode or have in the past on previous episodes. Before we do the draft, though, we are going to just check in very quickly on the trading block. There's a few interesting players that we're going to continue monitoring. Marcelo Meyer, the veteran shortstop from Tampa Bay, might be the best fit for what we need. Still a pretty good defensive player with a better bat than we've typically had among our middle infielders for most of this playthrough. Concerns are he's going to be 31 soon. He's fragile physically, a couple of negative personality traits, but nothing that's a real deal breaker. But he's also not just signed for this year. He's making $37 million next year as well. Now, fortunately, the Red Sox kept half of that contract when they traded him to Tampa. But it would still be a pretty big investment for us for a player that's not perfect, and it would be very expensive in terms of the prospects we'd have to get up. Sal Stewart and Spencer Torkelson are a couple of right-handed hitters who might work well for us as corner outfielder, first base, DH type guys. We're also kind of viewing a potential reunion with Brian Ramos as something similar. And then Ivan Herrera is a catcher, and our former catcher Drake Baldwin are also out there. Baldwin, one of the least expensive options out of the players that we've talked about. I don't think there's anything obvious that I feel like we need to do right now or that I want to do given where prices are. But over the next 2 to 3 weeks, as we do get closer to the trade deadline, those are some of the players that I'm continuing to keep an eye on. Pitching-wise, honestly, I don't know that there's any difference makers. Mason Miller and Andrew Nardi, the top 2 pitchers on the block, are pitchers on our team at this point. So I don't know that there's going to be a huge difference maker available to us. We'll certainly be exploring guys who aren't on the trade block, and who knows, as we move forward over the next week or two and get past the All-Star break, there may be a few more teams that decide they want to be sellers. But at this point, I think if we do much in the trade market over the next 3 weeks, it's probably going to be a bit more focused on position players than pitchers. Taking a look at our team statistics, first in the American League, more accurately tied for first in the American League in runs allowed, and we're in the top 3 in every pitching category except for walks, where we're still a respectable 7th. In contrast, we're 6th in runs scored, so not quite the middle of the pack, slightly on the positive side of the 15 teams in the American League, but if there's a part of this team that needs a little bit of help, it's certainly the offense, and that's something we're going to continue monitoring over the next couple of weeks. And with that, we will turn our attention to the draft. And as I mentioned, a lot of great feedback and thoughts from a ton of viewers as far as what we should be doing in this year's draft. A couple things to kind of highlight at the start. John Lambert brought up the point about sharing the mock draft with viewers ahead of time at the end of the last episode before we kind of ask for help. That may help the input be even more strategic, and I think that's a great idea, so I will try to remember to do that next year. And as we talk through the players that we're considering taking here in the draft, I will share where the mock draft has them going, just so we get a little bit of an idea as to where there might be value, and players that we're going to need to pick here at number 21 if we want any chance at getting them, and players who we might be able to hope slide to us in the 2nd, 3rd, or even later rounds. Kind of a mixed reaction broadly from viewers to the draft. I think in general, everyone agrees with me that it's kind of a meh draft. There's not any pound the table buy here at pick number 21, and there's not really a player that I'm absolutely in love with here. Interestingly, somewhat of a split. Several of you are strongly encouraging me to avoid going with pitchers, Kevin McDowell and Avery Shaham among them. John Hunter and John Lambert both suggested maybe at least waiting till the 2nd round for pitchers. But to turn things around 180 degrees, there were also a lot of viewers who said that the class of batters was so overwhelming that they would completely understand if we ended up going with a pitcher here. So as we begin this episode on Friday afternoon, I don't know exactly where we're going to end up going, but we're going to talk through the key players and the big input that I've gotten from viewers, and hopefully come to a decision that helps us make a good choice here in the 1st round, but perhaps just as importantly sets us up to hopefully get some good talent in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th rounds and beyond. And we'll start with the pitchers. There's 6 of them that we are considering here. I'll start with the 2 that we didn't really talk about in the last episode, but players that I've kind of scouted in the interim. One is Nate Giroux, a high school player out of Rutherfordton, North Carolina. Looks like if he completely develops, he could be an above-average starting pitcher. Only a 4-pitch arsenal, and that's going to really require the changeup developing as well as a little growth in his fastball to get there. Throws in the low 90s, not the smartest young man in the world. He is a guy who's projected to go early 3rd round in the mock draft. Certainly would not take him in the 1st round. 2nd round, depending on how things break, it's possible he could be the guy. And certainly if he did end up lasting longer than the mock drafters expect, and he ends up available in the 3rd round or beyond, he could be interesting value for us. Mike Alad, another guy that I also like. Looks like if things develop well, above average stuff, movement and control. Another guy with a potential 4-pitch arsenal, has some more positive positive personality traits with the high work ethic and the low financial ambition. Extreme ground baller at 18 years old. He was a guy that I was hoping maybe would last until the second round, but he is actually projected to go number 24 in the mock draft. So if we don't take him right now at number 21, I think it is pretty unlikely that we will get a shot at Mr. Alad. Do tend to think we'll probably go in a different direction here in the first round, as much as I do like him as a prospect. We'll now turn to the 4 other pitchers that we're looking at, and these are all guys that we talked about at the end of the previous episode and that we've gotten an opinion on from a number of members of our worldwide scouting department. The guy that our scout likes the best and thinks his 5-star potential is starting pitcher Doug Kelly out of Calhoun, Georgia. His stuff and his movement honestly aren't far off from major league quality, even though he's not yet 19 years old. The control we think can be pretty good, but he's got a lot of work to do there. And his slider, changeup, and sinker aren't far off major league quality. The concerns are that he's only going to be a 3-pitch guy, and if one of those pitches, most likely the slider, doesn't develop much more from here, he may struggle a little bit to keep hitters off balance with only a 2.5 pitch arsenal. He also doesn't throw incredibly hard, not the smartest guy in the world, and not holding on runners is certainly not his strength. Interestingly, Kelly was projected to go 17th in the mock draft, so presumably if we're going to take him, this is going to be our only opportunity to do so. Blade Staff likes Doug Kelly, although he is concerned a bit about the high bonus demand. Our slot at this point is $5 million, so we'd be going pretty high over slot with Doug Kelly. Fortunately, we do have some additional money set aside, and it looks like ownership is willing to let us use that money fungibly between potentially bringing on players in trade and signing prospects, so we can go a bit over what we've reserved and a bit over slot, it appears, at this point, if we decide to go to Kelly. He was kind of the number 2 guy on Hold Door's list, and YME943 also like Mr. Kelly. So 3 of our esteemed members of the worldwide scouting department like Doug Kelly, and if we're going to get him as a member of the Oakland A's organization, we're going to have to do it right now. I mentioned that Hold Door was one who liked Kelly as his second choice. Hold Door's first choice was actually Chris O'Donnell, Skates O'Donnell, and he is a very interesting decision for us here in the first round, because in the mock draft he's projected to go with the 20th pick in the second round of the draft. We will be picking 22nd in the second round, so he's projected to go just before we'll be making another pick. Some of the things that I like about O'Donnell, and some of these were mentioned by Hold Door, potential 5-pitch arsenal, and 3 pitches are pretty close to major league quality right now. He's already reaching the mid-90s, which is the highest velocity of any of the high school starters we've talked about. We think his stuff could be exceptional, plus movement. Some of the concerns, his control ceiling of 50 is the lowest of the 3 high school starting pitchers we're looking at. He's got a few negative personality traits, and his stamina is not incredible. I think he could be a real interesting choice for us in the second round. As I mentioned, the mock drafters suggest that he's going to be off the board just before we go, but there is a part of me that thinks if we go in a different direction in the first round, there's some probability that O'Donnell would fall to us in the second, where he might be pretty interesting value for us. And then the third of the high school pitchers, Eric Wilcox. is another guy that if we're going to pick him up, we need to pick him right now. He's supposed to go as a supplemental first rounder, number 37 overall. So he's projected to go 20 plus picks before we'd be picking again in the second round. Wilcox, interestingly, is the choice of a new generation and the choice of our worldwide scouting department overall among both pitchers and hitters in this draft. Wilcox got the most support. Jarek Braxton, James Miller Media, Dodo Dude, Quetime, Expedient Falcon, Alkshi, Not My Four-Ply, DLL First Base 14, all really liked Wilcox. Blade Staff and Wyme943 had him number 2 on their lists. You can see why, and people know that I love drafting pitchers, and I'm willing to roll the dice on high school pitchers, and there are a lot of things to like about Wilcox. We think his stuff, movement, and control could all be above average. He's got the potential for a 6-pitch arsenal, which would be the most expansive out of any of these 3 high school starters we're talking about. Stamina and hold runner combination is probably the best. Only positive personality traits with the high adaptability and intelligence. Throws in the low to mid 90s already. A ground baller with ground ball tendencies. Negatives, he's looking for a good chunk of money, almost as much as Kelly at $8 million, so he would be over slot. And like many high school pitchers, he's got a lot of work to do with his control as well as his stuff. But if we're going to get Wilcox, it seems like right now with the 21st pick is going to be our only opportunity to pick up the lefty. And there's one final pitcher that we're looking at here in the first round, and he's one that generated a good amount of commentary, and that's Jonathan Swampy Niswanger, 21-year-old out of Purdue. He's one of the furthest along players in this entire draft. His fastball is major league quality, splitter not far off major league quality, and we think his stuff, movement, and control could all be above average. High adaptability and intelligence, extreme ground ball tendencies, throws in the mid to high 90s. Not a ton of stamina, but he's good at holding on runners. So there's a lot to like about him. I'm not generally inclined to go with a relief pitcher in the first round, and in this case, I don't think I will. But a couple of viewers were very positive on Mr. Niswanger. Third Degree Top Gun and Paul West both have loyalty to and or familial ties with the Boilermakers, and wanted us to see if we could get Mr. Niswanger on board and perhaps even take him in the first round. He is a guy who did not go in the 5 rounds of the mock draft. So although I know some of you strongly encourage me to take college players earlier and more often than I sometimes do, and there's also a contingent out there that probably encourages me to be a little more aggressive and perhaps take relievers earlier than I sometimes do. Given that Swampy didn't go in the mock draft in the first 5 rounds, I find it hard to believe that I'm going to pick him in the first or second round. I'd love to bring him on board and bring that Boilermaker to Oakland for Third Degree Top Gun and Paul West, but my hope is that the mock drafts are generally correct and Mr. Niswanger may last a few rounds and maybe be nice value for us as a 3rd, 4th, maybe even a 5th round pick, depending on how the draft breaks. So I'm honestly not sure at this point whether we're going to go with a pitcher or a position player. We'll have a better idea of that as we move forward and go through the position players one at a time. But my plan right now, I think if we go with a pitcher here in the first round, it's going to be Kelly or Wilcox, 2 of the guys who are projected to go in the first round. I would love it if a Chris O'Donnell or a Mike Alod fell to us in the second round. And I would really love it if a Nate Giroux or a Jonathan Niswanger was still around for us in the third round. But if we're going to go with a pitcher here in the first round, I think it's going to be Kelly or Wilcox. I don't necessarily think those guys are a whole round better than O'Donnell. But as we talked about, O'Donnell lasts till the 20th pick in the second round in the mock draft, while Kelly goes about 30 picks before that, and Kelly goes about 40 picks before that in the mock draft, and Wilcox goes about 20 picks before that in the mock draft. So if any of these guys are going to be around in the second round, I think it's likely to be O'Donnell, although I could argue to myself that Wilcox and Kelly at this point, both $3.5 million over slot for us, that the money they're asking for could result in one of them lingering on the market as well. So I guess I won't say that O'Donnell is out of it quite yet, but if we do go with a pitcher here in the first round, I think it'll be Wilcox, Kelly, or O'Donnell. Turning to the position players who are available, there's 5 that we got thoughts on from viewers, 2 of whom we're not going to take in the first round, so I'll talk about them first. One is Julio Almendarez, second baseman out of Denver, Colorado. Looks like he's got a versatile bat, a little bit of speed, and a versatile glove. I correct my poor speech, and a bat that could, if it fully develops, be pretty interesting for a middle infielder. Not looking for a ton of money, it's just $230,000 in terms of his signing bonus. Kevin McDowell, he wasn't at the top of his list, but he was on the list of prospects to consider. Almendarez went in the 5th round of the mock draft, so I could certainly see us uniting with him down the line, but probably just in terms of value, not a guy that we would take here in the first round. And we can say the same thing, if I can go to the most efficient way to find him, about Hidetato Ogata, a catcher out of Japan. Really like the glove, high leadership, not a lot of speed. Bat that looks like it's going to be borderline major league quality, but quite honestly, with that glove, a borderline major league quality bat is still potentially a interesting backup catcher. And if you get really lucky and have some unexpected talent change randomness in our favor, he could become a starting catcher. But Ogata did not go in the first 5 rounds of the mock draft. Kevin McDowell had him down on his list. James Miller Media suggested maybe taking him later in the draft as a backup catcher to grow for the future, and I think that's exactly what we might do with Mr. Ogata. If he's still on the board in the 4th or 5th round, as we expect, might be time to take a flyer on him at that point. And that leaves us with 3 other position players. Actually, another one who we're not going to pick in the first round, but I think would be more defensible to potentially take in the first round, is Eddie Blanchard. We think he can be above average contact, well above average home run power, above average gap power, although not necessarily great speed, and an average eye. He looks like a versatile defensive player, although not a particularly good defensive player. Some pretty nice positive personality traits. Expedient Falcon, as we talked about, was one of the scouts who preferred Wilcox. The large list of people who thought going with Wilcox, the high school left-handed pitcher, was the way to go. But if we were to go with a batter, Blanchard was a guy that Expedient Falcon liked. Blanchard in the mock draft is projected to go with the 27th pick in the second round, so in theory, he'll be available for us then. And because of that, I think if we're going to go with a position player, we'd go in a little bit of a different direction, but could certainly see a scenario where Eddie Blanchard is the name that we're calling in the second round. So that leaves us with two position players left to talk about, and these are both guys that are under serious consideration for us to pick here in the first round. Butch Wall, the center fielder, interestingly, is projected to go right at pick number 21. So the mock drafts had us taking the center fielder out of Wichita, Kansas. Wall was liked by Bladestaff, John Lambert, and Hijinks. Bladestaff thinks that... actually, I can't remember what Bladestaff thought about him, but I know that he liked Wall. The profile here is the type of profile, and I mentioned this in some of the responses to the comments from Bladestaff, John Lambert, and Hijinks, that I historically haven't been all that enthusiastic about picking. I like my hitters to actually be able to hit and make contact with the ball. And a guy who, best case scenario, we think has below average contact, and best case scenario is going to be striking out 180 times a year, likely, is not the type of player that I've typically gone after in my years of playing OOTP. But to be fair, with the acquisition several years ago of the international free agent Hidero Endo, and even the recent trade that we made for Bobby Cabral, I have gotten a little more willing to take a flyer on this type of player. And although we don't like the free-swinging nature of Butch Wall or his low intelligence, there are a lot of things to really like here. He potentially has a above-average eye, well above average gap power, and potentially exceptional home run power. He's got enough speed to generate a fair number of extra base hits with that gap power, and he is a more than competent corner outfielder, although certainly not an exceptional corner outfielder. So the big attraction to Wall is the potential incredible home run power. The concerns are, is he going to make enough contact and avoid striking out enough to justify having him on the roster to try to see how many home runs he can hit. And the most popular of the position players is Josh Huggins, and he's projected to go 26th overall in the draft. So like Mr. Wall, if we want to have Huggins in our organization, we are almost certainly going to need to pick him right now. Although Huggins was not as popular as the left-handed high school starting pitcher Mr. Wilcox with our worldwide scouting department, he still was listed on a number of ballots. It was the number one choice of Kevin McDowell, Quetime, among the others who liked him, John Hunter, Alkshi, Avery Shayam, DLL First Base 14, Hijinks, YME943 preferred that we go with a pitcher, but if we were going to go with a batter, he liked Huggins, and Huggins was also number 2 on Holdor's list. So a fair amount of support for Mr. Huggins, as I mentioned, number 1 in support among position players, number 2 overall. Interesting personality profile. Those of you who have watched me over the years know that adaptability, work ethic, leadership, and intelligence are the 4 traits that I care about the most. I also care about loyalty and financial ambition, but those to me are secondary or tertiary traits compared to these first 4. And it's a really interesting profile for Huggins where 2 of the things I really care about, adaptability and work ethic, he's really good in. And 2 of the things that I really care about, leadership and intelligence, he's pretty bad in. So I guess that nets out to 0. So maybe not a real positive, but certainly not a real negative either. Not a great defensive outfielder, but he can play a competent left field or right field if needed. The reason to bring Huggins on board is certainly his bat. We think his home run power can be almost wall level if he fully develops, with above average gap power, above average eye, and above average contact. So a pretty well balanced bat. Not the fastest guy in the world, but he's not horribly slow. I think he could be a real interesting player for us. And if, as I mentioned, if we do go with a position player here, it will be Huggins or Wall, who were the two most popular position players in the scouting reports that we've received over the last couple of days from our worldwide scouting department. And those of you who dislike it when I take high school pitchers high in the draft are going to be disappointed in the direction we go in this draft, but we are going to go with the guy that I think is the cleanest prospect overall. Butch Wall, very intriguing to me. I don't love the strikeouts. I don't love the concerns about his contact, and I don't love the low intelligence. Josh Huggins, pretty interesting profile, but as we talked about, the personality overall is kind of a wash. Not bad, not good. Can probably say not bad, not good about his defense and his speed as well. Certainly could be an interesting bat. And he was, as we talked about, the most popular everyday player with our viewers. But I don't think he's a perfect prospect. I don't expect that Huggins or Wall will be available in the second round. As we talked about, both of those guys are expected to go right now or in the next several picks. Doug Kelly, I like a lot. Don't love the low intelligence. Don't love that he doesn't throw incredibly hard. Don't love the inability to hold runners. But my real big concern with him is that he's at best a 3-pitch guy, and he might be a borderline 3-pitch guy. Chris O'Donnell, pretty interesting, but a few negative personality traits. Potentially the lowest control of the high school pitchers, and of the guys that we're talking about, he's the one who most reasonably might actually fall to us in the second round. So we are going to go with the lefty pitcher, Eric Wilcox. He was the one that, as we talked about, was the highest rated by our worldwide scouting department. Wilcox got the most thumbs ups. Don't think he's a perfect prospect, but the stamina and the hold runners stands out relative to the other pitchers we're looking at. He's the only of these 5 guys that we've talked about player with all positive personality traits, including adaptability and intelligence, which can be important in terms of development, whether through normal course or I think in the development lab, although someday when OOTP does finally release an updated manual on OOTP 25, I'll hopefully have a more fulsome and perhaps educated view on that hypothesis. But positive personality, and he does have the potential to have a 6-pitch arsenal. Clearly, as you would expect with most 18-year-olds, he's got a lot of work to do to become a major leaguer. But I think that he's got a pretty decent floor. I think he likely will end up as a useful major league pitcher. And clearly, if he reaches his full potential, he is a very good, borderline, excellent major league pitcher. As we noted, we've got the money to go a little bit over slot here. We're going to go with Wilcox in the second round and hope that an O'Donnell falls to us in the second round, although that may be unlikely. Would love it if Alad was there, not expecting that. And as we talked about, Giroux and Niswanger, we would expect to see in the second round. As far as the batters, there's not a ton of hitting talent, as you can see, at least in terms of the high end, according to our scout. That's a reason for us, maybe just in terms of supply and demand, to have gone with a position player, a Huggins or a Wall. As I talked about, my hope is that, or I didn't explicitly say this, but Eddie Blanchard, who, at least according to the mock, makes it into the second round, my thought is that he's a very similar player offensively to Mr. Huggins. He's admittedly not quite as good offensively as Huggins if he reaches his full potential. I'll acknowledge that, but he's more versatile defensively, and he's also got all positive personality traits. I would love it if Eddie Freefall Blanchard does end up doing a free fall into our lap, or potentially into our lap in the second round, since I'm not expecting Huggins or Wall to be there. But I think that Blanchard in the second round is 95% of the bat that we think Huggins is, with potentially a more generally positive personality and a better defensive profile. So we are going to go with Eric Wilcox here with our first pick, and we'll see who makes it to the second round. And Chris O'Donnell, as we hoped, is still around. That would mean that we would go pitcher. Bubba Cessna, still around as well. And did we lose out on Niswanger? Oh, we lost out on the Purdue Boilermaker. And that is a definite upset. That, to me, it was a little weird to me that he was not listed in the 5 rounds of the mock draft. I thought we might be able to hope that he'd fall to us in the second or third round. But somebody else kind of looked at Niswanger, and unfortunately, he won't be part of our organization. So sorry for disappointing Paul West and Third Degree Top Gun. But with O'Donnell and Giroux both still available in the second round, we've got some interesting options among pitchers and batters. Unfortunately, Mr. Blanchard did not fall to us. Castaneda, who we talked about, or actually we didn't talk about Castaneda. Almendarez, who we talked about, is still around. But we'll go take a look at the draft log and see where Mr. Niswanger ended up going. And he ended up going a 7th pick in the second round to the Cardinals organization. So, as I noted, he wasn't projected to go in the top 5 rounds of the draft, so I pushed the envelope on him a bit. Was thinking in the 3rd or 4th round, would love the value for Swampy, but unfortunately, he will be, unfortunately for us, he will be staying in the Midwest with the St. Louis Cardinals organization. And Wilcox, as we talked about, is looking for $8 million, which is $3 million above slot, and a good chunk of the $8.5 million that we had set aside. We do, though, have, at least right now, according to ownership, the ability to dip into some of the additional money that we've got set aside this year to get guys signed. So we're going to go a little bit under on Wilcox, $7.7 million, see if maybe we can save a little bit of money on him. I'm guessing he's going to ultimately come back to us and say that he wants the full $8 million, and if that's the case, we'll certainly give it to him, but try to save every penny that we can. So we'll get an offer out to our first round pick, Mr. Wilcox, and then move on to our decision here for the second round. And before we make that second round choice, we'll take a look at the four players, position players, who still stand out as far as the highest potential available. Zach Almonte is the top of the list according to our scout, a guy who we think can be a bit above average in contact and gap power, well above average home run power, and an average eye if he completely develops. Kind of has a third baseman's profile, could certainly also play first base. Not a ton of speed, solid prospect. One of the things that I do like about these three or four highest potential position players that are left is that they're not looking for real significant money, so that would help us make up a bit of the deficit that we've created by going over slot with the player that we picked in the first round, Mr. Wilcox. Jim Bessler, a first base prospect, he's the one that's least interesting to me. No speed, low adaptability, not great defensively, although he is 6'8", so he still can ultimately probably have pretty solid results at first base with his great reach. The bat, plus contact and plus home run power if it fully develops, but not so much to really get me all that interested in him. Andres Castaneda, 18-year-old, looks like he could be a pretty good contact hitter, decent home run power, the eye a little below average, has one of the better personalities of the guys that we've been looking at, although he's not particularly fast and not particularly good defensively. And then Ken Hanna, a center fielder, has more home run power than just about anybody who's left, and we think his contact, gap power, and eye could all be average-ish to a little bit above average. So if you got average contact, average gap power, average eye, or maybe even slightly above average in all three of those categories, and you're a switch hitter with really good home run power, definitely some value there. Not a ton of speed. Another guy who's kind of mad defensively. I don't think any of these guys are going to be around in the third round. I'd love to get them in the third round, but I don't love any of them in the second round. Chris O'Donnell still being on board is pretty interesting to me. He's the guy who was projected to go with the 20th pick of the second round, just 2 picks before where we are right now. So he's lasted a little bit longer than the mock draft would indicate, but certainly the highest ceiling prospect that's out there among the starting pitchers. We talked about there's mixed things with him. Some negative personality traits, although I guess if you're going to have negative personality traits, as I talked about earlier, financial ambition and loyalty are the two that concern me the least. And he does have high adaptability, although low leadership. Throws harder than the other high school starters. Not a ton of stamina, which is not great. But he does potentially have a 5-pitch arsenal, and 3 of those pitches are pretty close to major league quality right now. He's also a guy who's only looking for slot. In a perfect world, what we would do would be take one of the batters right now who's looking for a number that's under slot for the second round, and then come back in the third round and pay slot to O'Donnell when that slot number was lower than it is today. But I don't have any confidence that Mr. O'Donnell will still be around in the third round. And since I'm not in love with any of those position players we talked about, we're going to go back-to-back pitchers. And I know some of you don't like this because you've made the point, and it's a fair point, that we've been able to find pitchers through the trade market. We've been able to cobble together a pretty good pitching staff over the years, and maybe we should invest a little bit more in position players, but I think O'Donnell's the right pick here. So we are going high school pitchers back-to-back first and second rounds here, which I know is infuriating to some of you. And moving on to the third round, it's a matter of who's going to be on board. Will Wook Bradford Nate Giroux and some of these other pretty highly regarded pitchers still be around? Or will it finally be time to pivot to a position player? And Giroux is gone, although Wook Bradford is around. Taking a look at the batters, and 3 of the 4 guys, Almonte, Castaneda, and Hanna, that we talked about are still around. Almendarez is still around. The Japanese catcher Hiratata Ogata is still around. So I think it's probably time for us to pivot to an everyday player. And interestingly, the first baseman who was asking for $1.2 million, who was the least interesting of the 4 position players to me, is the only one that's off the board. So I think it worked out reasonably well that we went with O'Donnell in the second round, and we'll get to take a decent position player prospect here in round number 3. And I wouldn't mind if a couple of these guys linger on the market. We're going to go with the guy with the least power of the 3, and Andres Castaneda, but the best contact hitter, the best personality of these 3 guys. Not a ton of speed, only competent defensively. But if he does end up being a left-handed hitter with, in a perfect world, 70 contact and average to above average home run power, I think that could play reasonably well for us in Oakland, and think he's decent value here in round number 3. And moving on to round number 4, Julio Almendarez, who we talked about, was projected to go in the 5th round in the mock draft, is still around. Like the potential bat, decent speed, versatile defensive player. Not looking for a ton of money, so he's interesting. The center fielder Ken Hanna is still around, though, and he's a guy that I think is interesting value here in the 4th round. We talked about him. He could be a little bit above average in contact, gap, power, and eye if he reaches his full potential. Realistically, I think a best case scenario is more that he's average in those 3 categories, but average in those 3 categories with a pretty good home run bat is still a potentially interesting offensive player. So I like both of these guys to continue looking at, and Mr. Ogata, the potential really interesting backup catcher out of Japan, is still available too. So some interesting options among the pitchers or the hitters here in round number 4, and there are actually some interesting options among the pitchers as well. And I think it's almost certain that at least 1, possibly 2, and in a really weird case scenario, 3 of the position players that we just talked about will be available to us in the 5th round. So in the 4th, we are going to pivot to something that some of you suggested, and we're going to bring on a relief pitcher. And it's not going to be Wook Bradford, the high school relief pitcher, who we think could have really interesting stuff to go with a nice personality. But we're going to go with someone who hopefully can help us a little sooner than that, and that is Doug Weiss out of Austin Peay. He is a guy who is not far off major league quality right now, and we think ultimately his stuff, his movement and control could all be above average, potentially an interesting fastball slider combination. A lot of stamina for a relief pitcher, high adaptability and intelligence. Think that in the 4th round he's pretty interesting value, and he's also a guy who's not looking for much money at all, so that will help us a little bit given the extra money that we're going to end up spending on our 1st round pick. Want to hopefully maintain as much financial flexibility as possible as we get closer to the trade deadline, and certainly the more money we have available, the more flexibility we're going to have in terms of giving up fewer players in trade if we can retain a little more of some of these contracts that we might be taking on. So we are going to go with Weiss here in the 4th round. 3rd pitcher of the draft, 1st reliever, 1st college pitcher. Moving on to round number 5, Bradford, Cessna, Triggs all still around. Those are guys that we like, but we'll check in on the batters now. And Hannah is still around. Interestingly, Almendarez is gone. Ogata, the potential backup catcher, is gone at this point. But Ken Hanna, I think, for a 5th round pick is pretty interesting value. Switch hitter with potentially really good home run power. The speed and the glove are meh, but meh is not bad. Meh is just meh. And I think a 3.5 star center field prospect in the 5th round is pretty interesting. My hope is that a couple of those pitchers I just mentioned that I've spent some time offline looking at and haven't dug into in great depth with you will still be around in round number 6. But we are going to go with Mr. Hanna here in the 5th round. And we still, in a worst case scenario, will have the opportunity to bring in Hidetado Ogata with a 6th round pick. But let's see what the pitchers look like. And we've lost a few of the guys that we liked, but Bubba Cessna is still around, along with 3 other pitching prospects that are 3.5 star guys. Some of them a little more than we'd like to be paying in the 6th round, but not the end of the world. Jeff Taranto is fine. Not the type of guy that I'm real excited about. Best case scenario, he's a back of the rotation type of starter, and question whether that 3rd pitch is really going to be major league quality. Doesn't throw really hard, but for a 6th round pick, can't really be begging. Juan Castro, another guy. The question is, does he have a 2nd or 3rd pitch? Probably has a 2nd pitch with the fastball. The question is really, will the changeup become a 3rd pitch for him? And will that fastball ultimately be a major league quality 2nd pitch or a pretty lame fastball? So again, 6th, 7th, 8th round, not a horrible pick, but not that exciting either. Dave Baumler, the question with him is his control going to really progress? Like the high work ethic, like the fact that he could have a 3, 4, or 5 pitch arsenal when all is said and done. Definitely like Baumler better than Castro or Taranto. But Bubba Cessna is a guy that I've been looking at for several rounds, and there's some things to really like and some things to really not like about him. Question whether he's going to be able to consistently get the ball over the plate. Best case scenario, we think he's a below average control pitcher, but we think that his stuff could be great. Solid movement, some good personality traits, great at holding on runners, decent stamina. I think both Cessna and Baumler are interesting, but I'm going to spend a little more time offline also looking at some of the more advanced college players like Devin Sharp, for instance, out of FDU, who could be a useful bullpen arm in the not too distant future. And here in the 6th round, we're going to continue trying to fortify the pitching ranks. We're going to go with Dave Baumler, the right-hander out of Wolverine Lake, Michigan. Got a lot of work to do on his control, but like the high work ethic, like the fact that there's a potential 5-pitch arsenal if everything works out. Cessna is definitely intriguing, and the high-end stuff for Cessna is incredible, but his control is just as bad, and we don't think he's got the same type of ceiling. And he's also going to be incredibly dependent on that changeup developing to become a viable major league starter. I like them both, but we're going to go with Baumler here in round number 6. And Taranto is still around. Cessna off the list now. Take a look at the batters. And there is a name that I was hoping to see here, and he is still here. And I'm not talking about the catcher, Ogata, who's still out there and still on our radar. But we were hoping Pete Bush would fall to us. I think for a 7th-round pick, he's pretty interesting. A guy that we think could be slightly above average in terms of his contact power and eye, has some positive personality traits with that high adaptability and work ethic, and pretty good outfield range and a nice outfield arm. Although his error rating is not exceptional, he's still a better defensive player than some of the position players we were looking at in the earlier rounds. And we are going to go with Pete Bush here in the 7th round. I'm not making these decisions as rashly as you might think. I have spent time offline between most of these rounds, looking at a number of players and kind of preparing myself for what the options are. So I don't want to get into painfully excruciating detail with you on these decisions. So we'll try to move things along a little quicker, at least from your perspective in these final rounds of the draft, even if I end up spending an inappropriate amount of time offline thinking about these choices. And while I think that Pete Bush was nice value for what he is in the 7th round, we did end up pushing things just a little bit too far. And unfortunately, a guy that we've been talking about since the beginning of the draft, the Japanese catcher, who looked like he could be a pretty interesting backup catcher, is finally off the board. He went in the beginning of the 8th round before it came back around to us again. So unfortunately, we won't get him. But I do think there's still some interesting opportunities out there for us in these last 13 rounds of this draft. If I do anything particularly interesting or insightful, I'll be sure to let you know about it. And we didn't really end up doing anything all that interesting over the final dozen plus rounds of the draft. So when we think about the highlights of the draft, the high school pitchers Wilcox and O'Donnell in the first 2 rounds, and the college reliever Doug Weiss highlight the pitchers we brought on board, and Andres Castaneda, potentially interesting contact hitter, and then Ken Hanna and Pete Bush, both of whom we think may have the ability to eventually play a outfield spot for us and hit some home runs, are the most interesting guys that we picked up. Also picked up another starting pitching prospect in the 6th round. So a lot of starting pitchers, a lot of outfielders, a little light on infielders in this draft for the Oakland A's organization. So with the draft now in the rearview mirror, we've got the last 7 games of this 11-game homestand ahead of us before we get to the All-Star break. Hopefully we can go at least 4-3 over these next 7 games, and in a perfect world would love to see the team only maybe drop 1 game to Seattle and 1 to Chicago, win both series. And if we are able to go 5-2 over these next 7 games, that would get our record for the month of July back up to 500 before the All-Star break, and the point at which we're going to have to get real serious about what's going on in the trade market. And our number 1 pick, Eric Wilcox, has already rejected that $7.7 million offer. So we tried to save a few bucks. Didn't work out. At this point, we are just going to give him the full $8 million that he's looking for, and hopefully get him signed and into camp. And we've made it to the All-Star break, and we actually made it to our 5-2 record, which got us to 500 for this month of July. And we did it the really hard way, dropping the first 2 games against Seattle before winning the final 2 against Seattle, and then sweeping the 3-game end of the home series against the White Sox. So as we sit here on Monday, July 18th, taking a look at the standings. We've slipped back to 9 games behind in the AL West, but we are now the number 1 team with 5 straight wins in the AL wildcard race. 3.5 games up on the final wildcard spot, and now 8.5 games up on the Astros for being out of the playoffs. So in a pretty solid spot. Bobby Cabral has been hot of late, now tied for second in the AL in home runs. Colt Keith third in ribbies. Luis Lara is second in the league in stolen bases. Mentioned that Cabral has been very hot of late. He just won the American League Player of the Week award, 8 for 22 with 6 homers and 10 ribbies. He also had a 3 home run game in one of our victories against the White Sox. So Cabral is hot at this point, even though the batting average for the year is just .222. Taking a look at the All-Star Game rosters for our Oakland A's, a bit surprising given that we have the best or one of the best pitching staffs in the American League in terms of preventing our opponents from scoring. No Oakland A's pitchers named to the All-Star team. When we get into the position players, not a lot going on there as well. Just 2 All-Stars for the Oakland A's this year. Colt Keith, who at this point is a perennial All-Star, .250 average, 25 homers and 77 ribbies with a 135 WRC plus and a 3 WAR here on July 18th. He is having a nice bounce back year from a season ago and a nice first season of that potential 5-year extension that we signed him to. The other All-Star for us is a player at a much earlier stage in his career than Mr. Keith, but last year's American League Rookie of the Year, Jake Ortega, is now also an American League All-Star, hitting .286 on the season, has 24 doubles, and he is 18 of 18 stealing bases this year. Has finally started to run a little bit more this season than he did last year. Overall, his 126 WRC plus is actually down 20 plus points from a year ago, but with a 2.8 WAR here as we sit on July 18th, he looks set to have a 5+ WAR kind of season, and who knows, if he finishes up strong, might even approach the 5.9 WAR that he had a season ago. And as we sit here on July 18th, as I mentioned, the 5 straight wins got us back to 500 for this month of July at 57-42. We're 2 games worse than Pythagorean expectations. Still ranked 6th in the American League in runs scored. And you can see we're generally kind of a middling team in most of the offensive categories. We have slipped to 2nd in the American League in runs allowed. But we are still in the top 3 in almost every pitching category. The only exceptions being home runs allowed, where we're 5th, and walks, where we're 7th. 1st in the league in defensive efficiency and 6th in zone rating. So as we start thinking about the next week and a half or so to get through the All-Star game and get to the trade deadline, I still think that position players, some of the guys that we talked about earlier, may be the direction that we want to pursue. Taking a look at the pitchers, there are a few additional pitchers out there, interestingly, with Kevin Kelly, who was with us for part of last season, still on the team. Some familiar names to go along with Miller and Nardi, but at least there's a few other pitchers who are available right now. We'll spend some time perusing the options offline. Batting-wise, the big names that we talked about are all still there. Marcelo Meyer, Sal Stewart, Spencer Torkelson, Ivan Herrera, Brian Ramos, and Drake Baldwin, among others. Doesn't look like there's a ton of new additions that are necessarily going to be difference makers. But we still certainly seem to have the option to perhaps add a bat or 2 that could help us. With the fact that we are going to end up spending more money than we had budgeted, you can see we don't necessarily have a ton of money available, still we'll be able to take on the contracts that we need. We might just need to give up an extra prospect or two, or perhaps we'll need to trade away a major leaguer or two who's a little bit more highly paid to make things work out. But when all is said and done, if there is a player on the market who we think can help us in this 2033 season, guide this team back to the playoffs, I think with a 57-42 record, 99 games into the season, we certainly should be willing to pay the price to bring some help on board for the final 40% or so of this year. And as we think about where we might go in the trade market, I think the themes that we've been talking about the last few episodes still make sense. Maybe an upgrade at catcher, or someone to take a little bit of pressure off of the rookie Jaden Boakai. Although we like Maui Ahuna's defense, we suspected his bat might not be great, and that certainly has been the case. And then we look towards the middle to back end of the order in guys like Bobby Cabral, or more specifically Kevin Stubblefield, really struggling this year. A right-handed bat that can be a more consistent presence against right-handed pitching than perhaps Stubblefield has been, is another thing that probably wouldn't be the worst thing to consider adding. So we've got a lot of decisions and a lot of options in front of us, and we will talk about all of them in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.